Eisner nominated artist Gary Shipman has told a story on more than one occasion about his early life as an artist. He was trying to break into the comic book industry, and Klaus Janson, the famous longtime inker and colorist and penciler, having worked on things like The Dark Knight Returns, other Frank Miller projects, notably. Well, Klaus Janson offered Gary a job as a colorist. But Gary, he didn't want to be a colorist, he wanted to be a penciler. He wanted to draw comic books. He didn't want to just merely work in the comic book industry. So at the time, Gary turned him down. And then Gary's life radically changed after that. He became a Christian. His priorities changed. The outlook he had on life changed. The way that he viewed the comic book industry changed. And Gary stopped pursuing work in that industry. He didn't believe it aligned with his beliefs. It wasn't until years later when he saw Jeff Smith's Bone, a comic that Gary thought, well, if this is comic books and this is doing well and this is something that I could do. I could tell my own stories. I don't have to be like the rest of the comic book industry. And so Gary started to work on various projects over the years. He worked on his self-published comic book, the one that got him an Eisner nomination, Packin's Land. And he worked on books for other companies, and he did commercial art, and Gary worked normal, everyday jobs, pursuing his art, getting better, honing his craft outside of the influence of the comic book industry. And Gary, now looking back on those years ago when Klaus Janson offered him that job, he says, I was prideful. I was proud. I had an ego. I wanted to be a penciler. And he's glad that he didn't take that job. Still, he's glad he didn't take it. Not because of the pride or the ego, but because of who he became now. And I'm glad that Gary didn't take that job. You see, if Gary had taken that job, we would have never gotten this comic. This comic I'm about to look at. This comic I'm about to review, to analyze, to critique, to criticize. We would have never gotten this artwork. We would have never gotten this storyteller that Gary Shipman has become. The person with his own personal message that he wants to say. His own unique perspective, his own unique comic book work. If Gary had managed to become a penciler all those years ago, maybe he would have been a superstar. Maybe he would have been up there with the great names of comic book history that everybody knows. Every comic book fan knows Jack Kirby or Todd McFarlane or even Rob Liefeld, right? Maybe Gary Shipman would have been up there with Frank Miller. Or maybe not. Maybe Gary would have been a journeyman. Someone who fills in on issues here and there and gets to contribute in his own way. But the good thing is that didn't happen to Gary. And so we get this book, this work. We get great art. If you watch my channel regularly, you know that I often review comics off the cuff, sort of improvising the content of my reviews. This is not only because I'm, lazy, but that's certainly a large part of it. But it's also because there's a certain fun for me to start a video with very little idea of what I'm going to say, and yet somehow make it interesting. It sometimes works, and sometimes it fails. But at least if I fail, I didn't put that much effort into it. I know it's a terrible way to think, but I'm a terrible person. Yet every once in a while, something comes along that deserves more attention. It deserves for me to actually formulate thought, stop, and put effort and work into the review. This is one of those times. Titan, Mouse of Might is the latest work from Eisner Nominated comic book artist Gary Shipman. Gary is best known for his independent comic Packins Land, which he created with his wife Rhoda. This latest comic book work, Titan, is the culmination of Gary's many years of work as a fine artist and a commercial artist. Let me talk about my perception of Gary first. As a person, let's just do that for a minute before we get into the review. Through the power of the series of tubes we call the internet, it is possible to interact with artists and celebrities far easier than any other time in history. Sometimes we get more than we bargained for. Sometimes it's depressing to see what these people are like in day-to-day life. And sometimes it's uplifting. With Gary, it's uplifting. You see, Gary is a dedicated artist, working throughout the years to improve his art. He never settled or assumed his position. He never gave up his ideals in order to work on things he saw as inappropriate. And although I don't think it's a problem to sell out your more independent or more esoteric art to make money, it is an issue when someone is willing to sell out their ideals, their ethics, and their morals for money. Gary is a unique artist. There isn't someone quite like him in the comics industry. Gary loves the medium of comic books, and his love shines through on every page of art that he draws, every piece of art that he works on. Now for the actual review. Earlier this year, I reviewed the first issue of Packins Land. I analyzed the art and talked about Gary's use of shadow and light to convey emotion. I was able to look at the art and the beauty of that art and analyze it. But the story of the first issue didn't really make a huge impact on me. Certainly there were parts of the overall Packins Land story that were meaningful to me and that I still dwell on from time to time. But overall, my review was centered around the art. Well, here's the thing about artwork from 25 years ago, like Packins Land. The artist is a different person today than they were all those years ago. They've grown. Hopefully they've matured. Hopefully their art has grown as well. With Gary, both these things are true. This is a more mature work than Packins Land. I don't mean that in the industry way, like for mature readers only. I mean that in the sense that this isn't a futile attempt at storytelling. It's not a book that seeks to glorify violence, or to titillate, or to merely entertain. This is one of those comics that comes the closest to the emotional impact I get when I read a novel, or a really well-written non-fiction book with a really strong narrative. Don't get me wrong, I'm not demeaning or denigrating comics. I like comic books. But I usually don't resonate with a comic book like I do a novel. Storytelling mediums have different strengths. Comic books are a unique medium with a lot of virtues and strengths. But deep emotional storytelling isn't one that stands out to me personally. With this comic, however, it's different. The emotion and characterization in this comic are what stood out the most to me. I expected to love the artwork, and I did, but I wasn't able to analyze it in the way I did when I reviewed Packins Land, or when I read most other comics. I simply got lost in the story. That isn't to say I didn't notice the art. That would have been impossible in a comic as gorgeous as this one. But this comic was weighed equal in my mind. The story rose up to meet the demands that Gary's art, demanded. There were themes in this comic that stood out on the page. Deep themes of guilt and anxiety and fear and triumph and courage. I think we can all say that 2020 has caused a lot of anxiety and fear in people's lives. An election year where there is political unrest, a virus that took lives and jobs. And for me personally, this year has been stressful beyond those things that everyone has been dealing with. The fact that Titan dealt with the same types of things that I am currently dealing with was extremely emotional for me. I enjoy comics, I love the medium, but I don't often have deep emotional responses to the work. The only time in my life in which I've cried because of a comic has been due to Gary's work. And that's when I read Packins Land for the first time. there was a moment that I so identified with and was so speaking to my position in life at that time that I felt as if Gary was talking directly to me. Then I moved on and never cried about another comic book until Gary released his next one. Now, here in Titan's triumph over his own anxiety and fear made me cry. I'm okay to admit it. I cried during The Lake House with Keanu Reeves Christopher Reeve and Keanu Reeves. There you go. And Sandra Bullock. Well, I cried because the time travel plot didn't make any sense, but still, it counts, I guess. While I know that I have much work to do in order to conquer my fear and anxiety, Gary's comic was perfectly timed in God's providence to give me a little boost, to give me hope, and remind me that God is in control of my life. He is sovereign over all things. He is the master of the lives of men and of mice. So I want to say thank you to Gary. Thank you, Gary, for making this book, this comic book. In this moment, it helped me. I want you to know that. Now we're going to move to the artwork. I couldn't do a review of this book without talking about the artwork. Gary is a master of the craft. His art sometimes astonishes and always impresses. People like Gary not only because of his likable personality, but because his artwork is always amazing. So let's take a look at that. Alrighty, here we go. So this is issue 1 of Packens Land. Let's zoom out here a little bit. And this part's going to be off the cuff like my normal thing, but I know what I'm going to talk about. So if it's not as well produced as the other one, or you don't feel as if it's as erudite and intelligent, then that's why. Of course, created, written, and drawn by Gary Shipman, edited by Rhoda Shipman and Nick Principato. Gary starts out with a page and an aesthetic that has been talked about by a lot of people that have looked at this artwork on the internet, especially other artists, and they say it looks like a Will Eisner-esque splash page here. If you're not familiar with Will Eisner, he's one of the pioneering artists in this medium of comic books, or graphic novels, as he would later sort of coin the term. And he would do things like this. He would integrate the splash pages, the name of the book, into the page itself. And here we can see that with Gary. Now, Gary said, when that was first brought up, that he wasn't as familiar with Will Eisner. He got this sort of through other artists. Gary is deeply influenced by Frank Miller and Klaus Janssen's work. And I'm guessing that a lot of this was sort of gathered by that, and sort of through osmosis and secondary sources rather than from Will Eisner himself. We have a prologue here that is tying this in with Gary's previous work, Packens Land, as it is in the same sort of universe. And here I want to talk about these backgrounds that Gary does. His fingerprints are literally all over this artwork. If you ever watch him ink something, one of the techniques that he uses is he puts ink on his fingerprint, on his fingertip, and he puts his fingerprints onto the page in order to give it sort of an ethereal look. It's almost a curvy dot type of aesthetic where it just makes it look like there's this negative space, this energy pulsing through things. And he uses that for clouds, or just sometimes backgrounds, or mist, or different things. These are just strong panels, layouts, very readable the way Gary lays them out. As always, he directs the eye throughout. Here you can see that it starts up here where it says present day. You sort of follow the words down, the word balloons direct you to here. Even if they weren't here, you'd still be directed up towards Titan, and then down to these panels here. So the flow, and then of course pointing down towards the bottom. The flow of these panels always amazes me, and it's definitely something that I look at and I try to study when I'm looking at Gary's art. Here we have another page, Again, Gary's fingerprints in the background. Action of Titan shooting this. You can see it spring forward, and just works. Very well done. There's a nice one-page splash. Very heroic pose. Titan then goes inside, and this is where you start to get sort of his flashbacks, building up to his anxiety. And Gary does a good job of distinguishing the present from that past by integrating these panel borders that are shaped like M's. Basically, the idea of this noise of him in this tunnel, the noise deafening all around Titan as he's trying to break through into the realm of Earth from Packens land. And this, I think, is probably one of the things that people might overlook. They might see it as interesting, but they don't see that it's ramping up towards a bigger moment. And for me, this is something that I've tried to look at and tried to gather and keep in my mind for possible future use from me when I draw books. Gary is a masterful artist of both realistic and caricatured animals. And it really shines through on these pages, and you see these monkeys / gorillas / apes and these mice. Finally, you have this big culmination after he is drilled through. There's an explosion, and you can see that this is a pretty cool page in and of itself. And then here's one of my favorite pages. You see this like just ghastly image, almost of like a hell or something. You've got these dark flyers, these bat-type creatures that are from Packens land, and you see these people that look like lost souls, perhaps, reaching up from below, trying to reach for Titan, and an energy surging through him. And over here you can see sort of a Kirby dot energy, which is really neat. And we're back to these M's, and it hasn't gone away, right? The buzzing and the noise hasn't gone from present day Titan here. And he's affected by this. He's dealing with fear and anxiety that he's trying to overcome. And he is a hero, though. He's willing to go into this place even though he's afraid. He's anxious, and that's a good thing. Strong work. If I'm not talking about every page, it's because I have some things in mind, but every page looks amazing. The motion here in this one of Titan jumping from, in an elevator shaft, essentially from one place to another in order to not fall. There's a sense of peril here. Will Titan make the jump? Will he be able to grasp the ledge? And of course he does. But that is well done by Gary in order to make you think, yes, this is a creature jumping through the air. Shadow here reaching up, reaching over, pointing towards it. Well done. You have the setup of a character here, Malcolm, that Titan was working with in the tunnel, and that he feels some sense of guilt over having hurt. And here the anxiety and the fear is getting to Titan. And then you have this page, which I think is my favorite page of the comic, and the one that sort of I resonated with in a sense because of fears and anxieties that I might have myself. You see Titan closing in on himself. Here he is. He's allowing the guilt and the fear and the anxiety and the belief that he's not capable of overcoming it start to crush him inward. You start out with Titan big in this large panel. He is going in on himself, but he still has a presence, a bearing in the panel. He's dominating it. Then you have this medium shot where it's a little bit worse. And then finally you have a small Titan down on the ground. He is completely defeated at this moment, in a sense. He's given into his guilt and his fear and his anxiety. And you can see these lines that Gary has pointed towards Titan really sort of pushing him in, pushing at him, just oppression almost. And then he hears this voice. Then he remembers his duty. He remembers the obligations that he's made, the promises that he's made to take care of people, to help this person that's in this research center. And although this is a superhero comic book, it's one where you can think about your own promises and things you've made. What are important? What is the most important thing in your life? The duty that you have to both God, your family, things like that are what I thought of, and how I identified with this moment, with this character. And so Titan resolves to move forward. Now, this wasn't the only sort of issue of Packen's Land. There was 2 issues included in the first book, if you would, but they were separated into different issues, and I think that helps because you have a sense of accomplishment at the end of each issue. There's an emotional peak that Titan has reached. He has managed to overcome something. And if you think about how a story is structured with a character wanting to accomplish something, wanting to get to that moment of triumph, of obtaining their desire, whatever it may be. In this case, you have Titan wanting to overcome his anxiety and fear, or at least push past it right now to get further to his goal. So you have a long-term goal that he's trying to accomplish and a short-term goal that he's trying to accomplish. And so within the pages of this individual issue of Titan, you are seeing that resolution. You are getting a sense of resolution. And it's not just see you next time. Instead, it is a resolution and a satisfactory conclusion to an individual issue. Now, fortunately, there was 3 issues included, so we got to see more. And we'll take a look at some of the issue 2 here. I don't want to give away everything, but you can see that there is a lot here to enjoy and to like, and I want to make sure you guys see enough of that to give you a sense of Gary. Here again, we have one of those splashes that are like Will Eisner. I think this one works even better than the last. You have the building, the sides of the buildings incorporated here, separating them into individual buildings themselves, and this one works really well, I think, giving you this sense of a city. And Gary's really good at these cityscapes. I think that comes from being a big fan of Frank Miller's Daredevil. He saw a lot of cityscapes and Marvel in general, but Gary excels at this sort of nighttime in the city look, and hopefully we'll get more of that in Titan. Here is more examples of Gary's cartooning of animals, still wonderful. You can see here we have Titan making a promise that he's going to go save this other mouse that's in this research center. And he must accomplish this goal. He's made this promise to do this. And then here is a greater challenge than what in the first issue he sort of faced his inner demons, if you will. And here is a representation of what he has to overcome in a physical form. This cat that is a monstrous creature. If you can imagine a monster like this in comparison to a a hero that would be a human hero or a humanoid. Like a Martian Manhunter wouldn't exactly be a human, but definitely a more humanoid than Titan. But the proportions here. This is a huge creature. This is one that has the capability of killing Titan. He's not invulnerable. There is a sense of danger that is still palpable. And so Titan reaches into his pocket here and he takes some pocket sand and throws it at him. And no, he doesn't. But he does use ingenuity and sort of resources around him to initially stop the creature from getting him. And then he, like quite forcefully and violently, breaks off one of the creature's claws. And then he... sometimes you get wrapped up in these things, but you look at this as a sequence of events. You start out, he's got the claw. He's a momentary advantage over this large creature while he's getting battered himself. And he breaks off the claw. Now he's got a weapon. He's got a chance to fight back. But then the creature chomps him. See his tail come out here? Oh, but Titan's inside, and he's using the claw to stab at the inside of the cat, who spits him out. And Titan has a momentary victory here. But he feels another attack coming on. This is why I wanted to show the next issues. Gary recognizes that it's not enough to have a character face some sort of crushing anxiety or fear like that and then just say, okay, time to move on. It's not how it works. In the vast majority of cases, of situations. And so Titan is going to continually, at least for the time, deal with this. There's an inner conflict here of Titan that's going to continue. And that makes his character deeper and richer. And it allows us to identify more closely with him. The more human Titan seems, the more he is broken down and that he is put in perilous situations, the more we want him to rise up. And that, I think, is a strong point of this entry in Gary Shipman's comic career, if you will. But Titan must fight it. And he is trying to overcome those emotions and those fears, and yet we see him continue to do that, continue to push forward even though it's hard. And we see some of his strength, and the Mouse of Might moniker comes into plain view with this page, I think. And then we have this sort of dark version of Titan that he's got to face. And we'll leave you with that idea. But if you guys haven't purchased Titan Mouse of Might, I would strongly recommend that you do. I think it's a worthwhile book. I haven't been disappointed by it, and it gets my biggest recommendation. Like I said, obviously I put a lot of time and thought into this review that I don't most of the time. I put thought into it. I think about the comic and about what I'm going to talk about before I sit down. But sometimes I'll just read a comic and then I sit down and figure it out in the moment. And with this one, I had the opportunity to step back and to think about it over a long period of time. And I wanted to because of the personal, emotional connection that I made with the book. That doesn't happen very often for me, but my thinking as of late has changed because of circumstances in life as it does. And so I'm thinking about certain things in a deeper way than I had before. And I would encourage you guys to do that as well. Don't just consume media. Don't just be amused by it or entertained, but think deeply and critically about it. Not just a surface level, this is politically correct, or I don't like this because it doesn't agree with my mentality. Think about why. think about how that person's worldview is coming into play, whether for something that you like or you don't like, because worldview and a person's beliefs come into play in every artistic endeavor they make, especially one that has story and character and is as personal as a comic book can be. So this idea of not putting politics or religion into comic books is one that I can't get behind, because everything ultimately comes down to those factors, that worldview, your ethical, moral worldview, ultimately your religious worldview, comes into play no matter what. You make certain choices about what you're going to include in your comic book that are born out of that worldview. And no one can help that. They have certain beliefs about people, about how people should act, or what is an acceptable message to convey in art. And so for me, that's why certain movements and things that happen where people push back on what they see as an overabundance of opposite politics in their mediums, I can't always get behind. I can sort of relate to that feeling, but I think if you look at this book, this isn't something where it's some overt propaganda, no matter what somebody on the internet might think. Gary isn't necessarily pushing this worldview right at the front of it, but it's who Gary is, and so it comes out in his artwork. It comes out in these stories, and that is what happens when art is taken seriously. If you just wanted some sort of art devoid of the person's personal beliefs and their worldview, the art would become very neutered. It would become very bland, and that's not what you get here, because Gary is thinking more about how to create and construct a good story, and his worldview is coming out naturally in that. And the problems that we have with sort of the forceful and overly political books is that it's not done in such a way as to be natural to the story. It's forced into it. It's not coming out in the person's natural writing. And I think that's the thing to look at. So think deeper about things, think more critically about things. And as far as this book goes, I want to end again with what I said before. The idea that I said at the end of my sort of written and prepared review. Gary's comic was perfectly timed in God's providence to give me an emotional boost, to give me hope, and remind me that God is in control of my life. He is sovereign over all things. He is the master of the lives of mice and men. Again, thank you, Gary.
Explosion! Fly Fox!